for number 2 in our look at the great Albright Library. And I should say right at the beginning, something that Thomas Jefferson famously said, all that is necessary for a student is access to a library. And we all know how important libraries are, have been to our own lives, have been to our own educations, and how important they are to universities across the country and across the world. Now, we also know that what a library means is in the middle of a renegotiation. The libraries that we all might remember from another moment in our lives have evolved into something different. And so we are starting to reimagine what a library is and how it can function. We're all doing that in real time, so that's very exciting. Jefferson also said, "I have often thought that nothing would do more extensive good at small expense than the establishment of a small circulating library in every county, to consist of a few well-chosen books to be lent to the people of the country under regulations as would secure their safe return in due time." So when we think about the Albright Library, what we're also doing is putting it into context of the architect's life and the many people that he was associated with, in the context of universities more broadly in America and farther afield, and in the context of learning in America and what that means and how we have access to learning tools. It's exciting to see a building like this in the middle of a resurgence. And what you're looking at here is one of the many photos that will document all of that progress. What we want to focus on primarily is the main architect. You'll see that at the bottom of the screen, Howell Lewis Shea and Associates. Shea was born in Washington, D.C., grew up in Seattle, and took an architecture degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1913. When we imagine all the work that he did and all the work that is currently being done to bring the library back to life, we have to remember something that President Townsley said: we're reimagining the heart of our campus to better serve our students today and for generations to come. With this renovation, we are creating a vibrant, inclusive, and supportive environment where every student has the tools and resources to succeed. So thank you, President Townsley, for that. Thank you all for being here to come to terms with some of the most exciting aspects of the library and the context of that library. As you've just heard, when it reopens, whenever this will be, hopefully very soon, the newly renovated facility will be home not only to the library, but also to expanded student support services, writing and tutoring center, student disability services, and more important offices. And this will make the building much more of a hub on campus, and we imagine it should be. Libraries at universities are typically part of the core of campus life. One of the great aspects of the new library will be that some of it will be left untouched, leaving spaces open for future administrators and future people at the university and students to decide how to best use it. And that will be done over time as universities figure out how libraries can continue to expand. So that'll be very exciting to see that as well. One of the things that's so fascinating about the library is how the architect was so intimately interwoven with so many of the great architects of his time. And we find him in all kinds of places, working with all kinds of very interesting people on major projects that you are all sure to know. When he was a student at Penn, he made a series of important connections to some of the best architects at the time, and one was to John Wyndham. He worked with him very briefly, but you'll know Wyndham as the architect of the great Franklin Institute, and this is a building we all know and love in the greater Philadelphia area. So the architect of the library at Albright is not working off in a marginalized area. He's working within some of the main context of some of the most important buildings of the time and some of the most interesting architects of the time as well. Through Wyndham and his studies at Penn, Shea comes to see firsthand how important the neoclassical style was globally, especially to American architecture. And this wasn't unique to the early 20th century. This is an idea that had been working in American architecture since the 1700s, through the 1800s, into the 1900s, and indeed very much in the 21st century. When we imagine at the left a building that looks in so many ways like a Greco-Roman temple, we get the idea of a new classicism, hence the idea of a neoclassicism. And how we can identify it as being a new classical, you'll see the Roman porch, the columns, all of the little design features that are filtering through that system. One of the great architects from the Italian Renaissance, you are all sure to know Andrea Palladio, was in some way single-handedly responsible for looking back to antiquity, looking back to ancient Greece and Rome, and bringing those ideas forward. And this comes in what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth in some ways of these ancient Greek and Roman concepts. And it would make sense. So many of the humanistic values of antiquity, especially as it related to science and the arts and philosophy and mathematics, were all very much reinvigorated during the Renaissance. And so at the right, you have a prototype for a building that then a few centuries later gets picked up by the neoclassical architects in America, especially by none other than Thomas Jefferson. We see it in his own Monticello. There we have the very Greek and Roman porch right there on the front. And of course, you see it in the White House, among many other buildings. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, the early thinkers of this idea of America were very interested in democracy and also very interested in the republic. Well, the Greeks essentially invented democracy, and the Romans essentially invented the republic. And so an architecture of a new nation about democratic values and a republic where we all have a voice were filtering through in so many of these buildings. And we can see this in Jefferson's Rotunda at UVA, and of course, we can see this in the greater campus at University of Virginia, all designed around the main rotunda, which takes its shape from one of the most important buildings from antiquity, and that would be the Pantheon from ancient Rome. You can see the porch on the front of the UVA building. You can see the dome on the top of it. And when you're inside the Pantheon, as I know many of you have been, or certainly you've seen photos of this, you can see the great architecture at work here and the great dome, which is in so many ways the crystallization of the engineering of the Romans, with the open oculus at the top, allowing light through, the light that then shines on different sculptures inside, highlighting the pantheon of the gods depicted there. The building is a marvel. Here, my own son Fox is in awe looking up at it, as we all are in that building. And it's still very influential, and it was certainly very influential in the early 20th century when Shea was thinking about on-campus libraries in general, like the Jefferson Rotunda, or the many figures that were still working with that neoclassical design. That would be interesting enough for the architect of the Gingrich Library to have all of this connection, but it becomes even more interesting because as a student, Shea spent a summer in McKim, Mead, and White. McKim, Mead, and White is one of the most important architectural firms of all time in America, and certainly in the early 20th century. The firm did a lot, including designing the entire campuses for Columbia University and for NYU. And this probably is where Shea got more and more interested in university buildings. We see here how McKim, Mead, and White did the Lowe Memorial Library at Columbia. And again, how it borrows very obviously from that prototype that Jefferson is using. The idea of the porch in the front, the dome in the back, all of this is, again, very central to the history of American architecture. McKim, Mead, and White are in some ways most famous for a major contribution to architecture. And this is all important for us as we imagine the library at Albright, because what you're looking at with Penn Station, the original Penn Station from 1904, is in every way, in a very small handful, one of the most important buildings. And we have a direct connection to Shea, who's then using some of these ideas in his own architectural practice. You will know about the first Penn Station, no doubt. It was the brainchild of Alexander Cassatt, and you know his very famous sister, the painter Mary Cassatt, who went over to France and painted with the great Impressionists there. Alex Cassatt was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and his goal, by consolidating a bunch of railroad tracks, was to outdo his rival, the New York Central Railroad, which ran down Park Avenue to Grand Central. And in 1910, the building opens on the former red light district as an absolute marvel. On the inside, you have spaces that no one in New York or really anywhere else in America had seen, the scale of which was ambitious and felt a lot like America in the early 20th century, when bigger was better, when engineering solved so many of these problems. The scale is related to many major buildings globally. One would be the Roman baths of Caracalla. We see those at the right, a great big bath complex by one of the most complicated of the ancient Roman emperors. There is also the connection to the Brandenburg Gate and even to the scale of St. Peter's Nave in Rome. It was the largest indoor space in New York City. And what a way to travel, to catch your train there or to arrive in New York like this. And it becomes such a marvel that it becomes one of the most important buildings at that time. As you know, in the 1950s and 60s, car culture takes over from rail, and we have a need in the early 60s to demolish the great Penn Station, and it paves the way for the current Penn Station. One of the reasons behind the demolition, of course, was the economics of train travel, but also that the building had started to seem outmoded. Suddenly in New York, you had glittering skyscrapers, like you see at the right, the great Lever House, that seemed much more avant-garde, much more cutting edge, this idea of clean modernism. Less is more. This European aesthetic really becomes the new vogue of the day. And so Penn Station doesn't seem as exciting anymore, unfortunately. The demolition of Penn Station inspired a lot of pushback, especially by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who becomes very interested in saving important buildings and went out of her way, as you know, to save the great Grand Central Terminal. So the next time you're in Grand Central in New York, look up at that painted ceiling, look around you at all the wonderful art in that space, and remember that it probably wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the former First Lady or for the demolition of the great Penn Station. The great part of our story, again, is how the Albright architect was around for all of this as he was working, albeit briefly, for McKim, Mead, and White on Penn Station. One of the great features of the design is how the main facade, so the main side of the building, is separated into three main sections. You've got a nicely organized system from the left to the center to the far right, keeping a massive building much more comfortable, much more user-friendly. And this alone is fascinating in terms of design and logistics, but it becomes even more fascinating when we start to compare it to Shea's design for the Gingrich Library. Perhaps you've noticed before that the main facade has a similar set of threes, where you've got a main central core, and then on the left and right, you've got the two flanking cores. And what you're looking at here are not red flag poles that are going up in front of the building, but lines to illustrate that set of three and to show this is something that very likely Shea could have picked up in McKim, Mead, and White and how they used it for Penn Station. We can see the same set of three all the way through the history of architecture in America. Again, at the left, showing you how that design works. We've got two flanking sides, and then you've got the main core in the center. It's interesting to think about the Wren building in Williamsburg because it's the oldest college building still standing in the United States. The oldest restored public building in Williamsburg was constructed before the founding of Williamsburg, in fact, when Jamestown was still the capital of Virginia. So we're going way back to around 1700, a building that has been rebuilt several times after fires in the early 1700s and the middle of the 1800s. And yet there it is, still standing. And it reminds all of us of why you are faced with a dilemma when you have buildings that need to be updated or removed. Lane one would be to remove a building and start over, but then you're removing so much of the history of that building, of the organization, and of the context. Lane two would be to preserve that building. And that, of course, would mean updating it for any new purpose or for a contemporary audience, but not removing the core and the character of how that building functions, or else we wouldn't have a Wren building. We wouldn't know anything about the very oldest college building still standing in America. And so as we think about the Gingrich Library, it's part of a much bigger context of buildings that at some point in their lives seemed out of fashion, but then hung on and were restored and become centerpieces to campuses all over again. So we're looking forward to that. Another fascinating connection that Shea was linked to is to the great Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I know you've all seen the building and have been to the museum and maybe have even spent some time on the Rocky Steps there. After graduating from Penn in 1917, Shea went to work very briefly for Horace Trumbauer. You'll know the name Trumbauer. He's known mostly for his work on the PMA design. And the PMA underwent a series of discussions before the building was completed to bring it into the modern era. By 1895, the competition to design the new building was underway. By 1907, the site was selected on what was then called the Fairmount, up on the hill in a neighborhood in Philly we now call Fairmount. One of the interesting parts of all of this is how many competing firms there were. Everyone wanted to work on this job. And we have two main firms, Horace Trumbauer's, and then Zatzinger, Borey, and Mederi, who are not completely seeing eye to eye on all of this, but they end up each in their own way collaborating to all of this. Shea's role in this bigger project is that he's credited not only with getting all the various parties to work favorably together and to agree on the final design, but also Shea's role is as a brainchild for the basic thrust of the design. He did the main plan of the building, he did the main structure, and what's called a massing, which is the general form and shape of the building. Trumbauer is still very much credited as one of the most important architects to work on the building, did the detailed work and the perspective drawings and the like. But here we have Shea, not only part of the conversations with Penn Station and the Franklin Institute, but now part of the conversations with the great Philadelphia Museum of Art. Here we see it up on the Fairmount there as an Acropolis form in the city of Philadelphia. Everyone's welcome and invited. A building that, as we've seen with the Franklin and as we've seen with the Penn Station, is also designed in this set of three, in this tripartite manner. You've got the central part of the building and then the flanking wings on either side. All of this works very nicely inside the building. I know this because I worked there for a few good years. And it allows for what the first director of the PMA called a walk through time. So if you couldn't get to India or to China or Japan or Europe, you could walk through the PMA and feel as if you've left a metropolis and you've gone to other parts of the world. And of course, this is very civic minded as well, because not everyone has the means or even the desire to go on a grand tour and see things from all over the world. You could do it right here in Philadelphia in a walk through time down these long, wonderful corridors, separated to keep everything nicely encyclopedic and organized. And that long horizontal ground hugging feel of the PMA is something that we can see in another great building by Shea, and that would be the Morris Library at the University of Delaware. After working with two of the most important architectural firms in America and having studied at one of the premier schools of architecture at Penn, Shea independently works for about a year or so before establishing a first partnership that's later dissolved in the 30s, and then establishing another partnership in the 40s with his sons Howell Lewis Shea Jr. and William Dixon Shea, the firm, the Howell Lewis Shea and Associates, architects and engineers. He's gone on to be an architect with an important vision and lots of important connections, part of the Pennsylvania Society of Architects, the managing committee on a memorial scholarship, and being an all-around great figure in the architecture of the period. Notice how low the Morris Library is, low and long, ground hugging, not unlike the PMA. So some of these ideas are finding their way into one building and then into another. And we can certainly see some of that crossover when we take the Morris Library at the left, done a year after the Albright Library, and the Gingrich Library at the right. First things you'll notice is how low they are, how sleek they are, especially in the 1960s, how much ornamentation has been removed. This is clean, the aesthetic is more modern, and this wonderful connection between the brickwork and the white work and the Lancet windows, these long, thin, vertical windows. So many of the design features go from one building over to another. And we can continue this idea of putting the Gingrich Library in a bigger architectural context when we look at other university libraries done very much at the same time and living inside the same architectural silo, an architectural vernacular that comes to be called brutalism. There are lots of different kinds of brutalism. Sometimes you have brutalism that's much more geometric without a lot of detail work, like the library at the right. And then sometimes you have a much more exaggerated brutalism, where instead of rectangular windows, you have windows that are shaped differently and all the different design features that you see at the right in Yamasaki's great Oberlin College Conservatory of Music. Now, each of the windows at the left are designed for a specific function. 150 plus practice rooms, most with windows, allow students and musicians to have natural light, have a great space to connect with music and composition. And all of this makes for very good architecture. But to understand what brutalism really means, we have to go back about 20 years before the Albright Library to the very end of the Second World War, especially in the UK, because brutalism comes out of the last moments of the Second World War and in the post-war rebuilding period. And it comes out of the UK, which was, as you know, especially hit hard during the Second World War. What you're looking at here is a wonderful drawing made by the great British sculptor Henry Moore. And at the right, you're looking at a photograph of inside the London Underground, inside the tube. You might have heard that 79 tube stations were installed with 22,000 bunks and first aid facilities and chemical toilets. 124 canteens were established in all parts of the tube system to try to save as many people as possible during the Blitz, when an estimated 200 Luftwaffe aircraft bombed London every night. The first 57 nights, London was subjected to consecutive bombing. And this happens not only in London, but in Birmingham and Belfast, Bristol, Cardiff, Hull, Liverpool, Manchester, Portsmouth, Sheffield, Southampton, and others. And so all of this had to be rebuilt after the Second World War. And here's another very important photo showing you what that must have been like, hiding out during the Blitz in the underground. If you follow Henry Moore, which I'd urge you to do, you'll know that he's very well known for his reclining figures. And here they emerge accidentally, people reclining in the tube drawings, hiding out from the Blitz. But of course, the UK had to be rebuilt after the war, and there isn't an enormous amount of money to do that. And so out of 1950s British Reconstruction comes much more utilitarian design, much more low-cost social housing, institutional buildings like libraries and universities, and all done in a style that was economical, because it's much cheaper not to put ornamentation on a building, and it's much cheaper to use concrete, but also philosophically linked to the purpose. Because the very act of using a material like concrete, which is rough rather than highly polished and is a much more affordable solution, would remind everyone in that post-war period why precisely there needed to be a rebuilding campaign. There needed to be a rebuilding campaign because of the war and because of how many wonderful buildings were destroyed. And out of this comes this brutalist style that would forever remind everyone of how hard that war was to win and how difficult it was to rebuild after that war. And so painting it over and glossing it over and making it more trendy and more modern and more of our own time has always been an instinct, certainly, but leaving it as is reminds everyone of that moment in time when here's an economical solution to fix everything and build these new buildings, but here's a solution that also has a built-in philosophy that reminds us exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. In addition to the critics that you've just seen on your screen that come up with the idea of new brutalism, we have another major British critic, Rayner Banham, who, also working in this idea, promotes his ideas of brutalism. He does this in the mid-50s with French terms like béton brut, raw concrete, or art brut, raw art. And the idea is it's much more pure and more direct, and it doesn't have to be highly polished. And so this idea of brutalism as a term that links to that style of architecture comes in Britain because of some of these architectural historians. Banham said this: in the last resort, what characterizes the new brutalism in architecture, as in painting, is precisely its brutality. In other words, you don't gloss over it. You don't make it pretty. You keep it rough because that is exactly how it was intended. He says the true aim of the style had been, to quote Gropius's words about Bauhaus and its relation to the world of the machine age, quote, to invent and create forms symbolizing that world. And to make more sense of this, we need to draw an even bigger circle and go back before brutalism kicks off in the 1950s. And we have to go back a few decades in Europe to the school that was just mentioned, the Bauhaus. Now, I know some of you are very familiar with the Bauhaus. It is in every way the most important design think tank of its era, located in Germany. There were three directors of the Bauhaus. The first was Walter Gropius, who designed the very building for the Bauhaus that you can see here. And like the Albright Library and like a lot of good modern buildings, less is more. There aren't things that don't need to be there. It's very practical. It's very geometric. It's very user-friendly. And it allows for a kind of architecture that keeps up with the times. And it allows for a very basic geometry, horizontals and verticals, that are very easily applied around the world. This was done by design. The Bauhaus was thinking very much about how to make architecture that would fit anywhere around the world in a utopic sense, that We can connect globally based on an architecture that fits globally. And anytime you're in a city, be it Hong Kong or Paris or London, New York or Philly, anywhere, you will see modern architecture. And this idea then worked, that Gropius and the Bauhaus thinkers were able to make a very geometric architecture that would be global. And we have them to thank for that. Gropius also wrote the Bauhaus Manifesto. And he says, so let us therefore create a new guild of craftsmen without the class distinctions that raise an arrogant barrier between craftsmen and artists. Let us desire, conceive, and create the new building of the future together. It will combine architecture, sculpture, and painting in a single form, and will one day rise towards the heavens from the hands of 1,000,000 workers as the crystalline symbol of a new and coming faith. And so from the late teens into 1933, when Hitler closes the Bauhaus, because as you can imagine, he wanted nothing to do with this kind of global approach where we're connecting across borders and boundaries, even if it's through art and architecture, we have some of the seeds sown that we'll all do this together. There are no hierarchies where a painter is better than a bricklayer. Everyone's equal in this sense. And we will, the manifesto says, use art to better all of our lives. And this kind of aesthetic, pared down, geometric, easily translatable across the world in what would later be called the international style of architecture, is one that is born in the Bauhaus and then gets translated outward. And so as you're looking at Shea's design for the Gingrich, notice all of that pared down geometry, the less is more quality, even the scale of the building is very much coming out of those ideas of the Bauhaus. But the Bauhaus isn't the only game in town promoting this. In the Netherlands, there's a little group called De Stijl. Rietveld is among them, that is also looking to use geometry in new and exciting ways. In France, the great Le Corbusier uses his design for Villa Savoie, again, showing how modern architecture can evolve if it embraces some of the less is more aesthetic, some of the Bauhaus emphasis on modernism and geometry. Le Corbusier is an interesting figure because in 1927, he talks about how his buildings were places to live, but also symbolic of the machine age. And it was such a different moment in the early 1900s that there needed to be an architecture that kept up with it. We were much more technological and much more industrial. And therefore, Le Corbusier says our houses should be like machines for living. He said baths, sun, hot water, cold water, warmth at will, conservation of food, hygiene, beauty in the sense of good proportion. An armchair is a machine for sitting in, and so on. And so this kind of architecture that comes out of the Bauhaus and the Netherlands and France in the first 4 decades or so of the 20th century is one that really caught on. And by the time we get to the third director of the Bauhaus, Mies van der Rohe, in his great Barcelona pavilion, you can see these ideas completely codified, where inside and outside of a building are very much in flux. When you're outside, you've got walls that surround you. When you're inside, you have huge curtain windows that make you feel like you're outside. And this is all part of a rethinking of architecture that paved the way directly to brutalism and paved the way directly to Shea's version of modernism, which is very different from the work of Penn Station and some of the other projects that he would have been intimately aware of. Of course, Hitler closes the Bauhaus, and some of the thinkers and artists and architects that were able to get out came over as emigres to America. And Walter Gropius, the first director, was able to come over. And it's there that he set up some of these ideas in America in 1937 in his position at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and then the year later as Department of Architecture chair. So this is where we start getting these ideas in America, including in Massachusetts and then farther afield. As a result of all of this, by the middle of the 20th century, It was very clear in America that forward thinking meant this kind of modernism. You have people like Louis Kahn taking this kind of modernism and applying it to university buildings like the Yale University Art Gallery. And for Kahn, this kind of geometry, this basic, elegant form, the simple rectangle, where less is more, almost held a spiritual meaning. Kahn said a building is like a human. An architect has the opportunity of creating life. Form is the realization of inseparable characteristics. Form has no existence in material shape or dimension. And this kind of lofty thinking about art leads us to new frontiers, not only in modern architecture, but certainly in modern poetry, modern dance, modern music, in some ways, modern society, and certainly in modern painting. And so all of those hard-edged geometric modern paintings that you've seen over the years are all related to this utopic idea in the middle of the 20th century of finding a new kind of aesthetic, one that wouldn't feel particularly French or German or Japanese or Brazilian, but one that felt more international. And this idea was especially encouraged after the Second World War, when we all realized that putting walls up between us isn't going to end very well. And then we end up with the situation that caused the Second World War. One of the great parts of the Kahn building at the left is that it's hooked to the old Yale Art Gallery. And again, it's worth remembering that architectural trends do change and we all have tastes. Some of us like the newer one, some of us like the older one. But it's that tapestry together that makes this wonderful encyclopedia of the history of architecture. And so ripping one down to make it its own time would destroy all of that history. And so putting the two buildings together shows how different, in fact, they are. Kahn went on to do lots of great things in brutalism, including the great Salk Institute. Again, look at the concrete on the side. It's rough and it's unpretentious. It's not trying to be marble. It's not trying to be something more than it is. It's concrete and it's clean and it's simple, and the design will carry the building, even if the materials used are relatively inexpensive. Another great building of the period in brutalism, especially as we think about cultural and learning centers, is Marcel Breuer's great Whitney Museum. Well, that's how it was designed. Now it's under different ownership, but initially the Whitney Museum was another blocky geometric structure, one that felt like it had just been dropped from another land, with huge ziggurat-type walls and a fortress-like exterior, but very new and modern for the time. Breuer, another Bauhaus figure, again was very lucky that he was able to get out of Europe and set up shop in America, and becomes very famous not only for the Whitney and his other works of architecture, but for his club chair, which I know that you've all seen as well. Again, a kind of design that makes its way around the world. I.M. Pei is another architect dabbling in brutalism. We see this in the Everson Museum in Syracuse. Look at all that concrete on the wall there. And you go down south a little bit from Syracuse to Ithaca, and you'll find that same brutalist sensibility in the Johnson Museum at Cornell, the hulking geometry, the place of balance through imbalance that you find, and even at the right, as you can see, the unapologetic use of the concrete. We especially see brutalism go into hyperdrive under Paul Rudolph, who was chair of Yale's architecture department from the late 50s to the early 60s. And here, his great Paul Rudolph Hall is a masterwork in brutalism, heavy, concrete, full of philosophical and contextual innuendo, very much a part of its own time, and very different from a kind of modern aesthetic that Mies, the Bauhaus's third director, was thinking with. At the left, we have walls of windows that bring nature in. And at the right, you have more of a monastery within which you are studying. And it's that heaviness of brutalism that has offended many people over the years, in fact, that it felt too heavy and it felt too dark. But thankfully, there are brutalist buildings that have been able to stay on despite some of those protests against the heaviness and the brutality, if you will, of it. Rudolph ended up becoming a great architect in Florida as well, designing almost 60 homes in Florida. This was the last one that he designed. So brutalism meets the beach. And we can see brutalism meeting lots of different places, including modern sculpture here with minimalism and Donald Judd in the 60s, and then Judd's later work in Marfa, Texas. One of the most interesting twists and turns of brutalism, the style of the library, is how it becomes more curvilinear. Here we see the great Frank Lloyd Wright in his Guggenheim Museum keep that heavy concrete geometry, but adapt it to a much more natural style. Here at the right, a cross-section of the Nautilus shell, which shows some of the thinking behind Wright's exterior and interior inside the atrium of the great Guggenheim. Continuing this idea of curvilinear brutalism, we get into the great Marina City, one of the top buildings in the mid-60s out in Chicago. And as we thread the story along, we can see a lot of curvilinear forms using these unapologetic flat walls of concrete start to emerge here and there in different styles. At the left in the Arizona Memorial, and at the right in Saarinen's Gateway Arch, which one wouldn't consider a brutalist work, but it's born out of some of that same set of ingredients that we've been seeing. This curvilinear form is very much part of the era. It felt new and modern. And at the left, the great TWA terminal at JFK International Airport. And I know you've all maybe seen these photos, and some of you remember flying through the great TWA terminal. It was coming out of the future. And this is why we end up with some of that same style for architecture in the Jetsons TV show, aired from 62 to 63, set in 2062. This kind of idea that in the future architecture would look like the Jetsons was very much happening in real time as well in the early 60s in the third major World's Fair held in New York with the theme Peace Through Understanding. But take a look at the rust at the left. Eventually, some of these ideas would continue to evolve until they eventually don't seem forward thinking, they seem old fashioned. And this was very much different from the utopic aims of the World's Fair. This idea that we can all come together where technology and progress would help save us and make us better civilization. When we think of one of the great on-campus libraries in the country, the Brutalist building for the library at UC San Diego, you get some of the sense of the World's Fair lifting off the ground, almost like some sort of rocket ship right out of the atomic era. But as we think about architecture in different moments in time, architectural students will have a couple main themes to fall back on. And one of those themes that would be drilled into architects and historians studying any of this would be how things change over time. And one of the great lessons is told in the story of Pruitt-Igoe. Pruitt-Igoe was a great big housing community in St. Louis that was born out of this idea that architecture can fix lives. It was based on a 1947 survey of St. Louis homes that found 33,000 homes had communal toilets, and 85,000 families lived in basically 19th century tenements. This was an opportunity to create something forward thinking, to show the world how architecture can help lives, shape lives, born right out of that Bauhaus idea that architecture matters socially and globally. It was a large urban housing project, first occupied in 1954. And even the name Pruitt-Igoe has an important legacy. Wendell Pruitt was an African-American fighter pilot in the Second World War, and William Igoe was a former American congressman of European descent. So even the mixing of the two together suggested a kind of leap forward where everyone could get along if we have to do this only in the world of architecture. Well, 1972, we have a televised demolition of Pruitt-Igoe. And in so many ways, it was a symbolic destruction. After only 20 years, all 33 buildings, 11 stories, they all come down. And it reminded architects and thinkers of something very important, that when you start removing architecture, then you have a hole where that was. This was an important structure that wasn't working, but now we have a certain set of limits to how utopic architecture can function, and a big hole in the chronology. When we think about 9/11, for example, and how the decision was made not to just clear everything out and rebuild, but to do it in such a way that it paid homage to what was there, then we are coming up to a post-Pruitt-Igoe way of thinking. Before, it might have just been easy to tear everything down and rebuild it. But after Pruitt-Igoe, the brakes went on a little bit to suggest, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't just tear everything down. And the Great Sphere that once stood in front of the Twin Towers, now at the right at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, in order to keep going and to remember what happened rather than simply erase a moment in time. Indeed, sticking with 9/11 for a minute, Ground Zero ended up with an extraordinary amount of wonderful architecture, like the great Calatrava transportation hub and the wonderful interior of all of that, where architecture can feel uplifting and can move you profoundly. And so that's where we are now in the 21st century, where there's a recognition that ripping down isn't always the way to go because it removes so much of the story. And there's a recognition to continue reaching forward, especially in architecture for university campuses, where we would expect this kind of thing, where we would expect a much more thoughtful consideration of the history of architecture. Frank Gehry's great Performing Arts Center at Bard is certainly a very forward-thinking structure, as is one of the libraries at the University of Chicago, and as is one of the great buildings at the New School up in New York. Universities know, especially in America, that buildings matter, and good buildings ought to be saved, and architecture ought to be considered in the overall prototype of the institution. And that's why it's very exciting to see what's happening with Shea and Associates' great building at the Gingrich. It's a moment in time, not only for Albright, but for the architect and for brutalism generally. Comes out of so much important dialogue about the middle of the 20th century with modern architecture. And as you saw at the beginning, it puts a flag for Shea and how important he was, not only in the Philadelphia region, but in American architecture more broadly. I would love to leave you with some parting words about architecture and why it matters and why we're all here because we like it. But I think it's better to stick with some of the great thinkers of architecture, really of all time. And one of those is Aristotle. By dint of building well, you get to be a good architect. Jefferson says, architecture is my delight, and putting up and pulling down one of my favorite amusements. Mies, as we saw, the third director of the Bauhaus, tells us that architecture is the will of an epoch translated into space. And he is right. Architecture shows you a moment in time. If we start paving over all of the brutalist concrete, then we lose the post-war need to rebuild cheaply, and we lose so much of that philosophy behind brutalism. It was a brutal period, and that architecture ran with it and embraced it. Frank Lloyd Wright tells us, a building is alive like a man, and its spirit is the spirit of its maker. Every great architect is necessarily a great poet. In our own time, Frank Gehry says, architecture should speak of its time and place, but yearn for timelessness. Don't keep trying to make it the most trendy. Make something that will make sense in years later, even if it's out of style. And then Zaha Hadid, one of the great architects of our own time, who was the first female architect to win the coveted Pritzker Architecture Prize, the Nobel Prize, if you will, of architecture, had this to say: for me, there was never any doubt that architecture must contribute to society's progress and ultimately to our individual and collective well-being. Well, I certainly think that's true, that architecture does that. And I know that you do too. It's important to look at buildings and to recognize that most of our lives are spent within architecture. Look around wherever you're sitting. And so much of us get our art from public architecture. You don't have to walk into a museum to just look around at your community or at your city and realize that all of this was designed by someone. It's very exciting to be here with you all to watch the progress of the Albright Library. And it's even more exciting to take you on this little journey of how the architect has his own wonderful story, how Albright has its story, and how architecture itself has its story.